Hello, and welcome back to our Alternative Protein Show sponsor podcast series. Today we are speaking with Robert Yaman, COO of the Alt Protein Show. Robert has a philosophy degree from Yale and spent 2 years as a software engineer at Google. In 2017, he left software to work on alternative proteins because he wanted to move society past the harms of factory farming. He blogs about alternative proteins at robertyaman.com. That's Robert, YAMAN.com.
Our conversation today with Robert was pretty wide-ranging. We tried to focus not only on a review of what we thought happened at the Alt Protein Show in San Francisco this last January, but also, and more importantly, Robert's blog, where he catalogs and indexes patents for clean meat technology. This starts from patents in the 90s to present. In that conversation, we try to understand the advantages and differences between the patents when it comes to trying to grow meat. I think you'll find it very interesting.
On another note, we have a new podcast series called Plant Stance, digging into food tech strategy, that we are producing in collaboration with Sprouted Ventures, a go-to-market strategy company that specializes in food tech and the plant-based category. In our first episode, we talk about our experience at Expo West, where plant-based brands really dominated the show. We delve into the positioning and branding of a lot of these companies and give you our takeaways and insights. Be sure to check it out on our website. You can access it easily at brandfirstnj.com on our homepage, and it's available on all other channels as well. So our experience at the All Protein Show is there was a lot of energy in the room. There was a lot of very interesting people and companies to talk to. We enjoyed listening to Ryan Bethencourt from Wild Earth. We enjoyed listening to Peter Rowe from Deep Branch. There was just some really good speakers there. And I think that I can't wait to listen to more of them on YouTube, as we had mentioned. But I think there was just so much there that, you know, it's such a promising future ahead of us with the food industry as we are changing it. And, you know, what did you think? I know you didn't have much time to listen to a lot of it because you were running around, but, you know, just out of curiosity, I think all the attendees, you know, were really, really happy with the way it turned out.
Yeah, I think overall it was a success, especially for kind of the inaugural proof of concept for the model of the Alternative Protein Show. I think our goal with the show was to run the conference a little bit differently than normal conferences. You know, we wanted to put a greater emphasis on networking, making one-on-one connections, and this was, you know, borne out in the expo hall, where you know, we put a lot more emphasis on that than
Right.
you might see at other conferences. And also, even at the format of the talks, we wanted the talks to be a little bit more intimate, smaller scale, so that people could make you know, one-on-one connections with the speakers. And I think that goal was kind of borne out. I think the biggest piece of feedback we got was that the energy in the expo hall was really high and really good for the whole show. And I think that was something we were proud about.
Right. I think one of the things I heard is next year we'll have to get a bigger venue.
Yeah. Next year, I mean, I hope the especially the expo part. I think it'd be great if that just keeps growing and growing until it's you know, enough for a whole day just to explore the entire expo.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think I saw you tweeted something before the show where you were kind of saying that it's time for all of the monkeys to get together and actually be able to talk with each other, not being at their computers and all of that. And I thought that was actually, you know, it's true, because especially in today's day and age, I mean, you're very active on Twitter. You're tweeting a lot, and your birds also tweet too. But you tweet a massive amount of information. And Robert, actually meeting you, I realized that you don't look like your tweets.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this is the this is where the major value of conferences is, where you're actually in the same room as people. You can make that, personal connection where you're, you know, reading each other's body language and facial expressions that you really miss out on when you're communicating digitally. So I think the reason we wanted to focus on these one-on-one connections is because um, that's meeting in person is really what I think solidifies really strong one-on-one connections. So that's what we wanted to emphasize. One of the things I was happiest about with the expo hall is that we were able to showcase some of the companies that are a little bit more under the radar, at least, you know, uh, as far as the whole industry goes.
Yeah.
There's some smaller companies. I'm thinking of like Loca Foods, who had like a really amazing
Yeah.
queso dip. I don't know if you had a chance to try that, but I thought that was
Yes. Yes.
fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these smaller companies that don't necessarily have the name recognition yet, but we were able to give them a little bit of a platform. I thought that was
Yeah.
cool.
It's very cool.
Yeah, the Sparrow or Spiro, I'm not sure how you say
Sparrow,
it.
yeah.
Sparrow was the cheese was amazing. They had
Did
so
you
many
try the
different
egg as well?
Yes, yes, tried the
Yeah,
egg as
good,
well.
right?
Yes, that was good too. But I couldn't believe how many different kinds of cheese they had, and they had a form you could fill out for what was your favorite. I had a hard time with that. I couldn't
Yeah, their
believe
product is great.
Yeah, there were just too many cheeses to taste. And then how do you know what cheese you just tasted unless you spent a lot of time distinguishing which cheese was which, you know? Anyway,
Yeah.
but their ambition is definitely in kind with their ability to make things taste like cheese without using dairy. And it was pretty wild. I think it was a camembert that I had that I was like, wow.
Yes, and another one I tried was Abbott's Butcher. They had
Oh
chicken
yeah,
tacos there. Oh my gosh, so good! I was so impressed with the quality of that product.
Yeah. And
yeah,
then there
they're
was
really cool.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Ecovative
Mm-hmm.
was so fascinating that they had the samples of what they had grown with mycelium, the little like pieces almost like look like a leather piece, and that I mean being able to experience that I have that with me still
Yeah.
is just wild.
And I guess like they can take small strips and fry them up almost like bacon. They had a flyer there about that. It's too bad the tables didn't make it. There were
Yeah,
supposed to be like tables made of the
the
mycelium.
high tops, right? Was that
Yeah.
because the rain?
Yeah, there's something about the delivery got mixed up. The delivery actually did come, but it was
Ah,
like at 6:30 at night or something like that, and it was past the point where we could like actually get it into the building. So yeah, it was a sad state of affairs because that would have been really cool. But
yeah.
I think their table was like pretty good without it
So,
still. So
Robert, a lot of what you are doing right now is surrounding patents within this landscape. Is that correct?
yeah, that's one of the things I've been writing about on my blog. I've a series where I look at all of the cell-based meat patents that have been made public so far and just provide some analysis and some more readable explanations of what kind of technology is in the various patents.
Sure. So I was looking at your blog and your many blogs. Um, you're pretty busy and prolific, and you have a refined sense of how to, talk about what's going on in the industry. There's the side of you that understands patent language as it refers to the science side of things. Which, after all, these patents are scientific, right?
Mhm.
Whereas, I mean, you could have a patent for a baby stroller that would, that could fly, but that language would not. It would rely on a scientific side, but not a biological side, which is just these are very hefty with biological, science. So,
Mhm.
what I gathered was that the difference between, some of these patents is there's genetic engineering known as GMO, right?
Mhm.
And then versus engineering and manufacturing. So people are patenting these processes, such as a patent for manufacturing, which really doesn't involve the genetic side, but it's still dealing with the cellular side. So it's actually the components of being able to have the logistics and the finesse to do the science within a almost like a loop that is continuous and that has its guides so
Mhm.
that they're always able to reproduce things like science is supposed to do.
Yeah, I think that I try to be cautious around the using the word GMO just because it has a technical definition, and I prefer to break the patents down into patents on the biology side and patents on the engineering side, which I think is kind of what you were getting at. And then on the biology side, there are some patents around how to genetically engineer cells to make them easier to um, proliferate, easier to work with. But there are also some biological work that's been done that don't involve genetic engineering that are also very helpful, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. I mean, from getting in deep with some of these, the language of this, like, for example, from what I gathered, Modern Meadow, for example, has really become an expert in terms of how they are the process of getting cells to either layer or how to grow them within structure so that there is still a viability within the core of the layer that they're growing, and trying to keep the whole
Mhm.
thing to stay alive.
Yeah, that's right. So each of the companies has kind of carved out a subsection of the technology and kind of focused their efforts there. And Modern Meadow has been, well, they had a series of patents on clean meat back in the earlier 2000s. Since then, they've moved to leather. But they were focusing on 3D printing as a technology for cell-based meat. And they have some really cool patents around how to basically extrude cultured cells in order to make slabs of meat using 3D printing that are really interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Bioprinting meat is pretty amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the first patent that they got was called engineered comestible meat, which is really just edible meat.
Yep. Just
So
another
they're
way to say edible.
engineering. Yeah, it's funny because they're the ones that actually have that as a title, whereas now they're not concerned with the edibility as much as to be able to grow products for the use of like in fashion or materials.
Yeah, it's really cool. If you trace um, the their patents from the meat patents that they were doing in the early 2000s to the patents that they were filing around leather later, you can actually see the similar technology being used in both cases. Um, so their original leather technology was based around 3D printing as well, where they print these sheets out of collagen secreting cells, and then the cells would build the extracellular matrix of the leather around them as they're being 3D printed.
Right.
Since then, I think they've moved to a different system where they're just creating the collagen itself from a host organism. I think that's right. But it was kind of interesting to trace the lineage of their technology from their early 3D printing work to where they ended up.
Right. It's
Yeah.
really evolved. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean the whole thing that I'm noticing is that, and I guess it does make sense when you talk about a bioreactor. It's such a strange concept because a bioreactor I think of almost as a womb, and maybe that's an incorrect thought, but
Mm.
having this place where this activity and growth of cells occurs, there's stem cells that have, right. So if you're using stem cells, let's just a little bit off topic, not specifically to Modern Meadow, but stem cells, from what I understand, uncharacteristically, they are cells that have not defined themselves yet, but they have the ability to make a definition of their direction as it relates to the biological entity that they're a part of and how they'll grow. So I could be a stem cell. I'm going to be involved with the vascular system, or I'm going to be involved in an eye or a muscle tissue. Is that so far correct?
Yeah, sounds right to me.
Okay, so what's interesting is that the methods that they're working on is to grow cells for food, not for growing animals, not to grow a sentient being, but just the parts of an animal, which is by definition why it's so hard to understand, because life, is something that you know involves a reasoning, almost like the reason for cellular growth is to create things that become aware.
Mhm.
Without going, it gets into an interesting area, but the whole point here is that you're trying to explain how these companies are coming to the ability to grow the cells using different engineered aspects, different manufacturing aspects, and sometimes making it so that cells don't have to come fully, full circle, but can have constituent other parts and cells to make it faster.
Right. Yeah, your comparison to a womb is interesting. There was somebody, I forget who it was, that had some material about cell-based meat where they said all we're doing is taking it from the bioreactor of an animal to the bioreactor of, you know, the metal tank, and really both are bioreactors in the broader sense of the word.
Right. Right. So the cells that are, going to design a structure to allow blood flow, thus making meat actually function with a biological purpose, thus making it possible for there to be oxygenation and making it possible for cells to continue to live and grow, is a component of something. And that was from future meat. It's a component of being able to allow this process to continue to be a regenerative thing, to continue to live, to continue to grow the medium that we want to essentially become, the meat that we eat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the thing is, without these structures forming, I guess my point is, and I'm sorry I'm dancing around this because I'm also trying to understand it, but it seems to me that in order to create meat, we have to mimic almost the growth of enough of an organism so that there's almost like a healthy interaction of cells. The question is what can you eliminate and what do you need to establish as your ground rules for how much of the biological processes actually have to be cultivated?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. If you look at the various technologies that companies are developing, there's really a spectrum of how much they mimic what happens inside the body. So on the one hand, you have modern meadow where you're printing cells in layers, which is not really what you'd see inside a body, right? Usually if you have a tissue, there would be vasculature in the tissue that would allow blood to bring nutrients and oxygen to every part of the tissue, which isn't the case in this 3D printed meat. On the other hand, you look at Integraculture's technology, they have a system that they call CullNet that basically involves concurrently culturing other types of cells with the muscle cells. So, like having a liver cell culture that you're running concurrently, and then having connecting the two cultures so that media can flow uh, in between the tanks. And what this does
Uh-huh.
is it allows growth factors secreted by the liver and placenta cells to help the muscle cells to grow. And what this is doing is actually kind of mimicking what process that happens in the body where muscles will get signals from other organs in the body telling them what to do. So this is like a much more um, biorealistic, if you will, technology than something else. So it's interesting that there's a spectrum like this.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It actually makes me think, could there be almost a motherboard involved? So a computer functions in a way where the motherboard is supposed to really be the processor that is explaining to the ones and zeros what they're supposed to do. Is that what you are far in advanced also as a programmer, as a former
Mhm.
programmer. So I'm is that the way in which a computer functions to give its message and go through a movement of information? How can you compare that, Robert, to what's happening right now with trying to engineer these cell tissues?
That's an interesting question. I mean, certainly, like in the Integraculture patent we just talked about, there are aspects of the system will be controlled digitally because you'll be able to get these feedback loop mechanisms with biosensors, and you'll be able to understand how the culture is doing um, through these sensors, and then it makes a lot of sense to use a computer to control which directions media is flowing, when various tanks should be connected, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. But I mean, it's almost like you're growing. Okay, so if you're a biologist, scientist, a group of people that form a company to grow cells, you're essentially the brain for those cells.
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
you know,
Interesting
and
analogy. I like it.
right. So you're the brain for those cells, but at what point might it be um, important to find a way for those cells to have their almost like a hierarchy so that they proliferate in a manner that is adjusted for real life, biological, the complexities of the biology of the cells. Like, for example, for stem cells, again, what we don't know, I guess, how they determine their direction, which way to go. What am I going to be? I mean, it's very this again. This gets into a gray area because although we can say we know that who invented the computer and what they were thinking, where it's gone from there, obviously, seems to be now a system that becomes almost self-aware with algorithms
Mhm.
trying to figure out and go into information, and there's this whole idea of the singularity. How do you think the singularity would affect the cultivation of cell-based meats?
Um,
It's a big question.
yeah, it's a big question. I'm not really sure. Um,
It, but if the singularity is as near as the what's his name from Google,
Ray Kurzweil.
Ray Kurzweil. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So Kurzweil loves to say that the singularity is near, and he's continually taking vitamins and minerals and all the nutrients so that he can stay alive for it.
Mm.
He has even his own line of supplements.
2029, it says.
2029. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't mean to belittle kind of what our efforts are now, but it does seem to me that there's something interesting about this idea of sentience with a computer, and yet here we are, groups of people trying to figure out how to grow cells, trying to figure out how to make this new system of agriculture,
Mhm.
um, of cellular. It's quite a convergence.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess I can kind of see the analogy where we're learning how to control these biological systems in a way that they previously weren't meant to be controlled. I'm not sure though.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's that whole meant to be controlled thing where I kind of also am cautious because I believe in science. I believe in the pursuit of knowledge. And I think it's very important for these things to exist, especially as answers to systems that already do exist and that have, basically put a lot of stress on the normal systems of biology of even the planet itself. So it's very much a necessary thing,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know.
Yeah. And I find too what you're doing, Robert, with or your ideas on integrating the cell-based cultures with plant-based products, very interesting. I was reading, your blog about that, and the idea of incorporating even 13% of animal cells into plant-based meat makes it more satiating and tastes more like meat, where people actually enjoy it, and rated it higher in terms of thinking it tasted more like meat.
Mm.
So that idea is very cool, and I was wondering if you could talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so just to give a bit of background on that, I recently put out a blog post about um, the notion of creating meat that is a hybrid of plant-based meat and animal meat. And this is, animal cells, not culture cells. So the then meat would not be vegetarian. And this idea was sparked by a patent, actually, that Supermeat had filed, where they did this study. And the patent was about combining plant-based meat with cultured cells. And they basically said that by combining fairly small proportions of cultured cells into their plant-based meat, they were able to really improve the taste of the plant-based meat. And the hypothesis they gave for why this was because the cultured cells naturally had heme, and heme was the secret ingredient for Impossible Foods that gave it their plant-based meat the really meaty taste. So basically, mixing in animal meat, whether it be cultured or normal, is a way to like cheaply get heme into the plant-based meat.
Right.
So yeah, that kind of sparked my interest, and I realized that first of all, it not being a vegetarian was not necessarily a bad thing from a business standpoint, because the recent explosion um, in alternative meats has actually not been driven by vegetarians and vegans, but rather what are sometimes called flexitarian, so people who want to reduce their meat consumption but not necessarily eliminate it.
Right.
For example, Beyond Meat's 93% of their consumer base are people who also ate normal meat, also eat normal meat. And then also, one other way that this could be really helpful is that on the cell-based meat side, people often talk about these hybrid products as a way to go to market early. So before the cultured meat is cheap enough to sell on its own, you mix it with soy or wheat or other plant-based materials in order to reduce the cost. But the problem I saw with that was that there isn't really much like that on the market right now, something that's a combination of plant-based and animal cells. So it doesn't really make sense to me to bank on that as a go-to-market strategy when that market doesn't really exist. So another good part about doing this hybrid plant-based animal meat would be to see this market early so that it exists by the time that cell-based meat companies are ready to use this strategy, if that makes sense. So that was kind of the whole idea.
Yeah, no,
Right.
it makes
Definitely
sense.
makes sense.
Why was it from was it liver cells
Yeah.
in particular? Why liver cells?
In the super meat patent?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't remember exactly. I know that their liver cells can be um, easier to create in some ways, and I'm just like spitballing here. I think that like since they were mixing it in with other materials, like having muscle cells may not have made a lot of sense, because the the benefit of using muscle cells is that they can naturally form these fibers, muscle fibers. But if you're
Right.
mixing it in with plant-based meat anyways, you don't really get that benefit. That's just speculation.
I think
Okay.
the Integriculture used liver cells as well in their experiments. So
Yeah.
there must be something about it that lends itself to that process.
Yeah.
Yeah. It could be something about the taste too. You know, the people use liver cells for foie gras as well.
Right. It's a very rich, like foie gras is supposed to be a very rich tasting experience. So maybe that's part of it. It's like almost an enriched meat,
Mhm.
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um, and then so that's heme essentially is what you're saying is the quality of the liver cells that is lending the heme to the plant based as a combination.
Yeah, I think that was Supermeat's hypothesis for why it was working so well. I don't think that they um, necessarily put that forth as like the explanation, because I think there are other aspects of meat taste besides the heme that it was probably contributing. But um, this is one interesting explanation. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean Pat Brown. So I was listening to Freakonomics, more recent,
Hmm.
podcasts, and they were interviewing him, and amongst other things, it's very fascinating. I wish I could, talk to him because he has he certainly is a super innovator. But he was talking about a few things, and one was that when he was hypothesizing the best accessibility to heme within the soy nodule, that for some reason soy plants have this nodule that is so rich with soy heme that you cut it open and it looks like a steak,
Yeah.
which is wild. But he thought that he would be able to actually use that, and for whatever reason he can't, so he had to synthesize it in a laboratory.
Mm.
But this lends itself to this concept that heme is so important to meat, and it lends itself to the direction that Impossible Burger had gone in, which is to try to make something. I don't know if it's so much as that they were trying to make it bleed, as that is like a result of them trying to make it taste like meat, right? So
I think the blood was a part of it, though.
well, it became maybe a part of it with marketing,
Yeah.
And I don't know which came first, but Beyond Burger certainly has done that with beets.
And to your point, if you're a vegan, you may not even want that or be, enticed by that. And I think, Robert, in reading over some of your blog, it was interesting to think about, okay, I'm not going after vegans, right? It's like you're going after flexitarians, people who eat meat but just want to reduce their consumption, and that's just a whole different market altogether.
Yeah. I'm curious about this bleeding point. Do you not think this is would be like a selling point for normal meat eaters? Like, is the kind of
We talked to vegans who feel that it's almost like a turnoff.
But
So I'm
yeah,
not sure.
but you're talking about normal meat eaters, right?
yeah, because that's really the important market, right? I mean,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a vegan, so I'm like, I have I don't know, I have to like learn about what normal meat eaters their mindsets are,
Right.
more academically. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
So my thought is the following: normal meat eaters, if you want to call that a thing. If you go into any restaurant, that if you're going to order a steak, they're going to ask you how would you like it. I would like it medium. I'd like it medium rare. I would like it rare. Blah blah blah. Right.
Mhm.
So that right there is this idea that there's choice, that there's a choice in how something is cooked. Now, when people are cooking something, if they're grilling meat, there's also a choice of the temperature at which they take it to and how that actually changes what it is they're working with, because the one ingredient they're working with is meat, right?
Mm.
So because they're choosing for it to be either rare or for it to be well done, that is going to have its own set of flavor components, of its experience and mouthfeel, and all of those things. So I think that that's why there's still something to be said. I heard a report where somebody was ordering, I think maybe it was on Freakonomics, they were ordering Impossible Burger 2.0. And the person, the waiter came and said, "How would you like that cooked?" And the woman goes, "Oh, I didn't know I could choose how I'd like to have the Impossible Burger cooked." But suddenly now there's this connection being made. I can actually take this ingredient and have it in, I don't know if there's a difference in the taste of it because you cook it more or less. That would be the question for Impossible.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder also if they were trying to get in front of the mindsets that people might have had about plant-based meats. Like, if a person who doesn't eat plant-based meat regularly has the impression that it's generally like dry and tasteless, maybe rubbery,
Yeah.
like emphasizing the fact that it bleeds is a way to say like, no, this is different than what you've had before. It's like a new sort of product.
I think you're right. I think
Yeah.
it's like this bioactive thing, or it's something that has properties that can be affected by the way that you cook it.
I guess it seems like more authentic in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
If you're talking about this hybrid where you're adding only a certain amount of cells, and to start with it's pretty brilliant, I think, that before cellular agriculture is necessarily ready for prime time, you are taking those cells from actual meat and combining them, but you're only using what is defined as the minimal amount of cells that would cause somebody to go, wow, that tastes like meat.
Yeah, and I think that just to clarify, if you're using like 15% animal cells, I don't think you're going to get to a point where it's indistinguishable from animal meat. like you would, for example, if you were doing 85% animal cells, 15% like soy, for example.
Right.
But I think the framing would be more, here's like an enhanced plant-based meat um, rather than a like blended animal meat, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, but in the same respect, I also wonder if there's a more effective concept. I believe it was Bill Gates who said that only 8% of the plant proteins have been actually fully researched.
Yeah,
Um, so to me, the research really on the plant based side needs to get its funding, and they need to open up some of these possibilities, because I've had plenty of things that are meaty that aren't meat. And
yeah,
for example, when we were talking to Wild Earth, we were talking to Ryan um, Bathencourt about mushroom cells, about mycelial cells, that he said that they're closer to animal cells than they are to plant-based cells,
Mhm.
to
right.
plant cells. Which, wow, I mean, that is amazing. But I've had a portobello mushroom burger, and it tasted very, very much like meat, satisfied very much like meat. It wasn't meat, but it
Mhm.
certainly was closer in and of itself as its own, thing, right? So unadulterated. But if
Mhm.
if you're connecting those things and starting, I mean, Pat Brown said the reason why he brought heme into this game of plant based is because it is what determines how something tastes like meat. And if that's true, fine. But I also feel like there's plenty of cells out there in the world of plants that could probably come close, if not closer. And
Yeah, that's
besides,
fair.
what is meat anyway? What is satisfaction in food? It's not only meat, but it does need to reach into that group of people that is continuing the need to have all of these practices for farming animals. So
Yeah, I've been yeah, I think this whole like 8% of plants have been explored thing is super compelling and super interesting, and a good case for why there should be more R&D happening on the plant-based meat side. I've been experimenting with making my own tempeh, and one thing that surprised me about tempeh was how much of the actual mass of the tempeh is bacteria, like this bacteria that you ferment on the soybeans, and the actual like cells themselves form a lot of the bulk of the substance, which is very meat-like.
yeah, that is it's fascinating, because the biological process of a plant, or frankly a mushroom, versus the biological processes of a cow or a chicken, how they can mimic each other, inform each other, and inform us to perhaps find the connection that is the holy grail to make things taste the way that we want.
Mhm. Yeah, lots to explore.
Oh
Yeah, there
yeah.
is a lot to explore.
Oh yeah.
So
And I'd like to also mention how what you propose is different from, let's say, what the Better Meat Co is doing, right? Because they take the majority is animal cells, correct, and then they add in a percentage of um, plant-based food so that it reduces the amount of meat being used.
Yeah,
Really, what you're doing is kind of the exact opposite, and taking the majority is plant-based material and adding the animal cells.
yeah, that's an important difference, I think. And their goal is to lower the amount of meat in the meat in a way that's gonna make it still taste identical to 100%. Whereas, like I said before, I don't think that's really a feasible goal with what I was proposing. So they're really different strategies. Although I think they both have the potential to lower total meat demand in the short term.
Right, exactly. Um,
but then the objective is to lower that and then to replace it with the cell based.
Exactly.
Right. So that's kind of a way to evolve a company, really, with the in a practical time frame of what is right now available technology.
Yep. That's the thought. You kind of start um, start the go-to-market part of the cell-based meat process earlier than you otherwise would, if you
Right.
want to think of it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So some of these, when we were looking at some of your patent information, I came across that Just had, I think it was the earliest patent was at 97
Something like that. Yeah.
among that collective, 1997, but that it was actually from, the gentleman who was really the progenitor of this idea, and that he learned about this, and he thought of the whole idea of cell-based meat, when he was in a concentration camp.
Yeah, it's really an amazing story. He came up with this idea uh, in a concentration camp and kind of pursued it for his entire life. Filed this patent on the idea of cell-based meat, but never was able to see his idea through to implementation. Um, yeah, it's a really compelling story.
It is a compelling story, and that patent was for the industrial production of meat.
Yeah.
Um, but now Just has the methods for producing tissue engineered meat for consumption, which was granted in 2000. And you were implying that the patent doesn't necessarily have as many details as it is an entire process.
Yeah, so that's an interesting patent that just has the patent itself isn't necessarily on a technology per se, but more on the idea and the process of cell-based meat. So if you look at the top level claim, it's something like culturing animal cells and then using them to provide nutrition to a subject, which is basically as bad as you can get in the cell-based meat realm.
Right. But the Van Ellen patent, which came first, this second patent, why is that a stronger patent technically?
Um, I think that, well, I mean, I should caveat this by saying I'm not a patent attorney, so take my opinions on things with a grain of salt. But I think that
Right.
if you read both patents, the Van Elen patent is not written by a lawyer, so it's a
Okay.
little bit less careful, I guess. And then the John Vane patent, which is the latter one, is um, had this very careful legal language in it, which I think is an indication that it's a more serious patent.
Right. So ideas through lawyers are stronger when you're talking about
I
legalities.
would think so.
Yeah.
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 Clearly, he was a prisoner of war, so he didn't have that luxury.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he filed at 97. He was no longer a prisoner of war then. But
Yeah.
I mean,
his daughter is now on the board, correct?
That's right, and his daughter's actually also involved in alternative protein show. I don't know
yep.
if you knew that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I did, and I didn't have the pleasure of meeting her at the time, but I do know that she's involved in other things too that are happening in the near future.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that you were mentioning, Robert, which is really interesting in terms of Just, is that the patent application, even that was given and granted in 2000, is going to be expiring in 2022.
Yeah.
So this is where kind of like you were implying that they may be licensing out certain aspects of it before that happens, but really what we're talking about is it's a group of scientists. If you generalize what's happening with all of this, I'm assuming that everybody really wants to, although have a patent to enforce their brand of technology. Whoever finds the best thing that they might, really hold on to that. But it's also an accumulation of methodologies for the greater good.
Yeah, and just hasn't really given any indication of what they plan on doing with the patent. Obviously they haven't taken any action against any companies yet because no one is selling this stuff yet. And yeah, we'll see what their strategy is, but I think the fact that the patent expires in 2022 kind of limits the extent to which this patent could be problematic for anybody who wants to commercialize the technology.
I can't believe that was filed almost 20 years ago.
Yeah, the idea's been floating around for a long time, but it's only really picked up steam in the last couple of years.
Yeah. So besides muscle cells, I know that fat cells are something that's very important, especially for like hamburger meat, like simulating it or growing it. Um, so there's fat and there's muscle cells. Are there any other cells that are, showing themselves besides liver cells, I guess, as well,
Mm.
um, that are defined as, important parts of this process?
I think if you're talking about the kind of end states of the cells, those are the three main ones: muscle, fat, liver, kind of in that order too.
Okay.
But going back to what we talked about earlier about varying degrees of kind of biomimicry that these technologies can have. If you really want to like get super close to what you have in an animal, you also, you have connective tissue, um, you have vasculature in the tissue, um, and then in the very extreme, you'll have like
You have to go much further.
small amounts of nervous tissue as well. But I think that realistically, muscle, fat, and liver is the big three.
Right. Right.
Hmm.
So those are the three that, at the very least, are have the culinary values to them, right? Because
Yeah.
yeah, so as far as the biological process of keeping something together so that it can, proliferate, that's another matter. But that would be more of on the side of engineering it so that it is continuous.
Yeah, I think maybe once you're at the stage of making really realistic steaks, you want to start thinking about connective tissue because I think connective
Mm.
tissue has some sort of culinary application once you're dealing with
Yes.
that. But um, yeah, that'd be a question for a meat scientist.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's like also like the lattice work and structure. The whole when you're talking about that, that really does kind of fit into that, because systems and methods for growing cells, how the cells adhere to something, right? So we talk about that lattice work or structure that needs to happen in order for those things to actually have a form versus a gelatinous structure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which it doesn't really matter as much when you're dealing with the first products, which will be kind of more homogeneous
Yeah.
substances like ground beef. Yeah.
Sure. I thought it was really interesting too. The future meat is they're going to send small bioreactors to farmers,
Hmm.
as a concept that you're involving, farmers, that you're actually having them become a part of how this meat's going to be grown, which does satisfy, unless I'm misunderstanding it, it satisfies a problem where, people will be put out of work in what their present growing animals, for farms are.
Yeah, I think that future meat has a pretty unique strategy in the industry of how they're planning on scaling and going to market. Instead of creating larger and larger bioreactors in order to capitalize on economies of scale, which is kind of the strategy that most companies are using, they have a cost model that says that by using smaller bioreactors and then just having more of those bioreactors, it could actually be cheaper. The benefit of this being that you could potentially integrate this into the existing supply chain for meat. So instead of having completely new source of cells for the meat packers to purchase, you can basically contract out what are essentially new than whatever a farmer is going to become to run these bioreactors, maintain them themselves, which is a really interesting
Yeah.
strategy. Well, and um, we'll see if what strategy ends up coming on top. But I think it's indicative that if the two cell-based meat companies that Tyson Ventures has invested in, Memphis Meats, which is taking a perhaps more conventional scale-up strategy, and Future Meat, which is a very different strategy. Um, so they've kind of like diversified their bets there.
Yeah.
Right.
I wonder if, it's a little off topic, but I wonder if George Orwell's Animal Farm were rewritten by a, biologist of present day, what would happen? What would Snowball do?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, But
Snowball would be a cell in the media. And
there you go. Well, Snowball would be a cell liberating himself, so I don't know if that's
then
necessarily. It is very interesting, though, how that as a almost as a back going backwards through time and how we related to even the farm and like thinking about the strategies of being able to keep. You said, I don't know what a farmer would become if they're growing cells, right, or if they have a bioreactor, but I think in large part you could just still call them a farmer.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that's important, at least in terms of making it relatable, also to be able to have an occupation that, would be able to continue. I know that Barnett was Barnett Spork and Morrison. He is a agricultural economist that was at the show, and he was trying to get companies that are cell-based to consider relocating to places in rural America to try to not only anticipate that there would be a cultural divide that there already is, but also to help kind of administer the process of maybe something that's an evolution and a revolution to still be able to apply to, jobs and to people, that already have occupations that are going to be uprooted, which is not a bad idea.
No, I think that's great. I was able to watch Barnett's talk on YouTube, or the recording of it, and I thought that was a very interesting talk.
What of all of this, as an evolutionary and revolutionary component, do you see as how you would like to move forward?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So I mean, we talked earlier about the hybrid meat company. And I considered doing something like that, but I decided that ultimately, because I'm a vegan and I don't actually eat animal meat, and I would have a hard time eating the product that we're making. It didn't really make sense for me to do it, so that's why I wanted to put the idea out there for the rest of the world to see if somebody else would do it. But basically my like guiding principle with my career is just how do I move this industry forward in the most effective way, whether or not that's starting a new company or not. So yeah, I'm kind of just open to whatever opportunities present themselves in the future. I think that I found like a good niche with this blog and writing about stuff. But in the future, if there's an idea that I want to see out in the world, I'd be open to starting a new company. But yeah, we'll have to see.
Robert, thank you so much for coming on the show and speaking with us.
Yes,
it's a pleasure sharing, get just your expertise, and it's a humbling experience, frankly, to talk to everybody in this industry that has so much to say, and we're really trying to ask questions that connect. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Robert, for taking all of our questions, even my weird singularity one. Anyway, hopefully everybody found this as interesting as we did. I know that this technology has a long way to go, especially when it comes to scaling up, but I thought we had some really interesting responses from Robert. Again, thanks.
Yes, thank you, Robert, for being on the show. And for everyone listening, you can find out more about Robert on his website, robertyaman.com. That's Robert, YAMAN.com. And also on Twitter. He's at Robert_Yaman.
Just a reminder, we did release a new show called Plant Stance, Digging into Food Tech Strategy. You can check it out on our website, brandfirstnj.com, as well as anywhere that a podcast would normally find itself. Bye for now.